Hi! Welcome to an overview of sewing terms for dummies. In this video, we'll cover some common sewing jargon to help you get started on your sewing journey. Now, many beginners feel overwhelmed by all of the specialized terms in sewing, which can lead to frustration and mistakes in their projects. When you're new to sewing, it can feel like you're entering a secret world where everyone knows what they're talking about except you. It's like entering a conversation where everyone's speaking a different language. You may feel like you're on the outside looking in, wondering what on earth it is they're talking about. By breaking down these terms into simple, easy to understand language, we can bridge that gap and help you on your way to sewing with confidence. You don't have to be a sewing expert to make beautiful projects, you just need to know the basics. We'll cover terms like selvage, bias, baste. By understanding the fundamentals, you'll be better equipped to tackle your sewing with confidence and precision.
You'll no longer feel like you're navigating a foreign country without a map.
So, join me as I decode the confusing world of sewing terms and make them easier for you to understand. Now, I've broken these terms down into 4 categories to help make things a little bit more clear. Please reference the timestamps in the description below if you want to skip to a particular category. Now, the first category is stitching related terms. The first one is a backstitch. A backstitch is essentially stitching backwards. It's when the direction of the needle / sewing is reversed. This is typically done to reinforce seams or the edge of a section of fabric that has just been run through the machine to secure the threads and prevent them from coming undone. Most machines have some sort of reverse or tacking button that you push in order to reverse the direction of the sewing. So the next one is baste / basting stitch. A basting stitch is a really long, straight stitch that is used for temporarily holding things together. It's meant to be removed. It is typically made of maximizing the stitch length to make it easy to remove once the final stitching is completed. This can be done either by machine or by hand. If done by machine, the stitch length should be set to the maximum length that the machine will allow. If done by hand, make sure there is sufficient space, maybe at least a centimeter, between each stitch to make them easy to remove once the final stitching is complete. Darning stitch. This is a simple running stitch where the thread is sewn along the fabric's grain to repair holes or mend damaged fabric. Perpendicular rows of thread are sewn resembling a weave. An overedge stitch is a stitch that goes over the edge of the fabric to secure the raw edge. Serging is a method that involves thread looping over the raw edge of the fabric while a straight stitch is being sewn simultaneously. This contains the raw edges of fabric to prevent fraying and ensures a strong seam at the same time. This requires a separate machine called a serger or an overlock machine. However, you can closely mimic a serger with an overcasting presser foot and an overedge stitch, which performs relatively the same function but to a lesser degree. Satin stitches are flat stitches sewn closely together, parallel to each other, that cover a section of fabric, typically the edge of a design. It is used most commonly in applique and embroidery. Stitch length is the vertical length between each stitch. This distance is important regardless of stitch type, as it will apply to every stitch, unlike stitch width. The automatic setting on your sewing machine is sufficient for most uses. However, you can make it longer or shorter based on your desired stitching effect. Stitch width is the width horizontally between each stitch. This does not apply to a straight stitch, but it is applicable on zigzag stitches, overedge stitches, and other decorative stitching patterns that involve horizontal movement of the needle. The automatic width setting of your machine is often sufficient, but you can either increase or decrease the width dependent on seam allowance and how much you want the stitching to show, as well as a variety of other factors. When using a straight stitch or a basting stitch, the stitch width should be set to 0. Tension in sewing refers to the state of the top thread on the sewing machine. This is how tight or loose the thread is pulled from the top of the machine down to the needle. This is measured with a tension dial on the sewing machine. While auto is sufficient most of the time, you can increase the tension or tighten the thread by moving the dial to +1, +2, etc. Or you can decrease the tension or loosen the thread by moving the dial to -1, -2, etc. A top stitch is the process of sewing along the very exterior edge of a portion of your sewing project. An example of a top stitch is when you sew two pieces of a bodice together, wrong sides together, and then flip them back over so that right sides are facing up. And then you just sew a straight stitch very closely all along the edge where the two pieces were just sewn together to ensure that it lays flat. An understitch is the same thing as, but opposite, a top stitch. Instead of sewing on the outer edge, an understitch is sewn on the very top of the inner edge when you're using facing or lining and want to ensure that it lies flat and doesn't roll back onto the outside. So now let's talk about some fabric and pattern related terms. So the first one is bias. Bias is the diagonal direction of a piece of fabric. It's stretchy. Any diagonal that intersects the lengthwise grain and crosswise grain, which we'll get to in a minute, is considered a bias. True bias is the 45-degree angle of the fabric in relation to any straight edge. Unlike bias, which can be any diagonal along a piece of fabric, the true bias is a precise 45-degree angle regardless of the length or width of the fabric. Bias tape, on the other hand, is a thin strip of fabric that is cut along the 45-degree angle of the fabric rather than along the grain to ensure that it is stretchy. This helps it stretch along the curves and fit around the perimeter of a shape more easily. It is typically made from woven fabrics and used on woven fabrics. Bias tape can be used to finish or bind seams, add a design or a pop of color to edging, and add decorative details to a project. Store-bought bias tape typically comes in single fold or double fold. Store-bought bias tape can be a little stiffer and a little bit more expensive, and it often has a limited color selection. You can also make your own bias tape at home. A bias tape making kit can make this easier. Fabric grain refers to the different directions of the yarn or thread in fabric. We're going to talk about the different directions more in just a minute. Facing is a piece of fabric that is used to finish the raw edge of open areas of a sewing project, such as a neckline or an armhole. It's typically folded to the inside. You know those little narrow strips you sometimes see along the inside of a neckline? That would be facing. The phrase or instruction on the grain typically refers to cutting a piece of fabric either along the lengthwise grain or the crosswise grain, meaning either the horizontal or vertical axis of the fabric. So just a few more fabric direction terms. Lengthwise grain is the direction of the fabric or threads that runs parallel to the selvage, which we'll explain in a minute. This is typically the longer side of the fabric, and it is also the direction of the fabric that has the least stretch to it. Crosswise grain is the direction of the fabric or threads running from one selvage end of the fabric to the other selvage end, the fabric width essentially. This direction of the thread has a little more stretch to it than the lengthwise grain, but not near as much as the bias. Straight of grain is basically just another term for lengthwise grain and means the direction of fabric that runs parallel to the selvage. Okay, moving on. Interfacing / stabilizer. Interfacing and stabilizers are types of fabric that add stability and sometimes body to a project. They come in a variety of weights, thicknesses, and types. Some are sewn in and some are fusible to the fabric through the application of heat. I often find myself using these when I want like the sides of a bag to stand up or something like that, but there are a number of uses. So another one is knit fabric. Knit fabric is a type of fabric that is made by interlocking a series of courses and multiple loops of yarn. Courses are horizontal rows of stitches that run widthwise, along with lengthwise rows of loops or yarn running across the knitted fabric. Knit fabric is stretchy. Knit fabric is stretchy. Knit fabric is stretchy. Stretchy. Knit fabric is stretchy. Examples of knits include sweaters and athletic wear. Next we have lining. Lining is an inner layer of fabric, typically smooth and soft, that allows a garment to move more freely or be more comfortable. It can also be used to hide seam allowance and raw edges. So next we have fold or on the fold. At the risk of stating the obvious, in sewing, the fold refers to the part of the fabric at the edge when the fabric has been folded in half. In patterns, the phrase to cut on the fold means to fold the fabric in half to line the edge of the pattern up to the edge of that fold where it says, go ahead and cut out that piece, and then when you open it up, you'll get a full piece with two halves that are the mirror image of each other. Another term is nap. And no, I don't mean this kind of nap. In sewing, nap refers to a fabric's texture, the grain of the fabric, and the direction of the fabric's fibers. The nap is typically something that you can feel in the fabric when you run your hand across it. An example of fabric with nap include velvet, corduroy, and suede. With napped fabrics, running your hand one way along the fabric will feel smooth, while the perpendicular direction will feel rougher due to the direction of the grain. Okay. Whoa. Into the lighting. Why do we get so orange? Seriously, why do we get orange? When sewing, nap should run down or vertically in a project. Piping is a type of trim or embellishment or to add a pop of color to a sewing project. It adds a rounded or ribbed edge to a project. It is made from fabric strips cut on the bias, to be stretchy of course, and cord. Piping is made by folding the strip of fabric over the cord and sewing the fabric together right along the edge of the cord. It can be made in any size dependent on the cord size. It can either be purchased at the store or made at home. Like bias tape, store-bought piping is typically more expensive and it can be somewhat limited in color selections. Now I'm sure you've heard of this one, but just in case, a raw edge is just an unfinished edge of fabric. With woven fabric especially, the raw edge can fray or unravel quite easily. Now I told you we were going to get to this one. Remember when we were talking about directions of fabric? So this one is selvage. Selvage is the finished edge of a piece of a woven fabric, which is created during the manufacturing process that prevents the fabric from unraveling. It's formed along the lengthwise edge or the long side of a piece of fabric. While it will keep the fabric from unraveling, it is not considered a finished edge. Now, a seam is just a line or fold that joins two or more pieces of fabric together. It is formed by stitching along that line or fold. Seam allowance, on the other hand, is the space along the edge of the fabric that makes up the distance from the stitching line to the edge of the fabric. Think of them like margins on a Word document. They are most commonly 1/2 inch, but can range in sizes. Weave. In sewing, the weave refers to the way the warp and weft threads, we'll get to warp and weft in a minute, are interlaced to create a fabric. Warp and weft are two basic components of woven fabric. The warp consists of the vertical threads or yarn that stay stationary. The weft is the horizontal component that gets woven / interlaced over and under through the warp. And woven fabric, to wrap it all together, is fabric made from interlacing two or more sets of yarn at right angles to form a two-dimensional woven fabric. Cotton is an example of woven fabric. Now the next two I'm sure you've heard of and are probably wondering what they mean. I certainly did when I started. So there's the right side of the fabric and the wrong side of the fabric. What do these mean? Well, the right side of the fabric is the top side of the fabric. It is most often recognizable in pattern fabrics because you'll have the bright, pretty, colorful pattern on top, and then on the other side, it's kind of dull and faded looking. Well, the top side is the right side of the fabric, and the bottom side, where it's all faded, is the wrong side. So basically the top side is the face, it's the one you want to show, it's the one you want to be facing outward, and the wrong side of the fabric is the underneath side. It's the side that looks paler and less vibrant and that you don't actually want to see that much. And the last one in this section is ruche, which is kind of a weird one, but I'm sure you'll know what it is when you see it. A ruche is a frill or pleat of fabric used as decoration. It's kind of like a pleated gathered ruffle all in one. It typically involves a single vertical point of gathering the fabric, which pulls the fabric on both sides of the gathered line up and together to form a ruffled look down the length of the fabric. It can also be done with two vertical lines, which creates more of a pleated look in between the two vertical gathers. Now, if you're still with me and you're finding this video helpful so far, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so that you'll get notified of new videos with more sewing tips. It really does help. Now, the next section is technique related terms, or at least that's the best way that I could figure out to group them. So the first one is applique. Applique is the technique of cutting out fabric shapes and applying them to a background fabric with machine sewing satin stitches. The fabric shapes are referred to as appliques. The next is clip. This is when small cuts or snips are made into the seam allowance at the edge of the fabric that allow the fabric to curve more smoothly. It basically adds a little bit more flexibility with the fabric. The length of these snips are really shallow. Take extra care to ensure that you don't make the snips too deep and end up accidentally cutting the stitches of the seam itself. Another one is binding. In sewing, this typically means finishing a seam to hide it or to hide a raw edge. Binding is most often accomplished through the use of bias tape. You've likely heard of this one. Casing is a small tunnel made around the edge of the fabric to allow for either elastic or a drawstring to be fed through. This is accomplished by folding down the fabric the desired width of the opening twice and then sewing along the very inner edge where the edge of the fold touches the main piece of fabric. You've probably heard of this one before, but the next one is dart. Darts are triangle or webbed-shaped folds in the fabric that is used to shape garments, particularly around the bust. To create a dart, the triangle or wedge is folded in half and sewn along the edge where the two edges of the triangle meet. Darting, which you've also likely heard of, is a technique used for repairing holes, damaged or worn areas of fabric with a needle and thread. It is the typical method for when damaged areas do not run along a seam or where a patch would be undesirable. Go back to the darning stitch if you want to learn more. Now, opposite of a dart, we have a godette, or is it godette? I'm really not sure. Anyway, a godette is a triangular piece of fabric that is added to a project, typically a skirt or dress, to give it more volume. Instead of sewing it together to retract space, the full width of the triangle gets sewn into the fabric to add additional width and flare. Similar to clips, there are also notches. Notches are V-shaped cuts that are made into the seam allowances to allow a curved seam to lie flat and smooth. Just like the clips, it's a technique used to add more flexibility in the fabric so it doesn't bunch. Like clips, these are shallow cuts and extra care should be taken to avoid nicking the sewn thread. Another one is pivot. Pivot literally means pivoting the fabric as it's being run through the machine /sewn. When the edge of the fabric is reached at a corner, in order to pivot the fabric, you leave the needle slightly down in the fabric and lift up your presser foot. While the presser foot is up and the needle is down, turn the fabric, typically 90 degrees, and put your presser foot back down so that you can continue sewing down the other side of the fabric without having to remove it from the machine or finish off the previous line of stitching and start a new one. Now, a term that you'll hear commonly in sewing project instructions is pressing. And pressing basically just means ironing. It is used in sewing the traditional way to remove wrinkles in the fabric, but also to press creases in place, set stitches, and open seam allowance, among others. Now, the last one is hem. To hem just means to finish the raw edge of a garment in order to hide the raw edge. This typically involves double folding the fabric in on itself to hide the raw edge. Now, the last section is tools. And the first tool is an owl. At least I think that's how you pronounce it. It's spelled A-W-L. Anyway, I think it looks kind of like a funky screwdriver. This is an owl. It has kind of a bulbous wooden handle and a pointy metal shaft, and it is quite pointy. It is used for puncturing holes in leather or canvas, apparently. It can also be used to mark certain things on a pattern, and it can also be used to increase holes. I also typically end up using this to kind of push something through something, or like push something through a hole. Now, I'm sure you've likely heard of a bobbin, but a bobbin is a circular piece that goes in the machine on which the lower fabric of the machine is wound. It can either be plastic or metal. They can either be dropped in at the top, known as a drop-in bobbin, or front-loaded into a case on the side of the machine, known as a front-loading bobbin. The machine makes a stitch by catching the bottom thread from the bobbin with the top thread from the needle. Feed dogs are a part of the sewing machine. They are teeth-like ridges that grip the fabric and move as you sew to help feed the fabric through the machine. They are located in an opening in the needle/throat plate and help create a high-quality stitch. Now, I bet you've heard of this funky term and probably wondered what it was about, and that is notions. So basically, sewing notions are just basic sewing supplies, small tools, and accessories. These include things such as needles, pins, scissors, a ruler, seam ripper, snaps, buttons, elastic, thread, hooks, list goes on and on. Notions are just simply small objects that aid in the sewing process. A seam ripper is a cutting tool that is used for removing or ripping stitches, separating seams, undoing mistakes, and opening buttonholes. It has a plastic handle and a metal head that looks a lot like a two-pronged fork, with a cutting edge in between the prongs. The tool is essential because you will need it for one of the above-mentioned functions at some point. At the very least, you will need to do it when you need to undo a mistake. Whew. While not exhaustive, we just covered some vital sewing terms to help you communicate better and improve your sewing skills. I hope this was informative for you and helps you feel more confident tackling your next sewing project. Now let me know in the comments what's one thing that you learned, or if there's anything else you'd like to know. Now, if you'd like to know more about the parts of a sewing machine, its accessories, or the necessary tools to get you started on your sewing journey, then you may want to check out these videos next. Thanks for watching!